the way people encountered Yogananda's teachings, or sort of stepped onto this path, was almost absurdly comical. It was like the book fell off a shelf and hit them in the head. We heard that from at least 3 people, where it was like they're walking through a bookstore, and suddenly this book comes falling down, and boom, and now it's in their hand. It's like, wake up, hello, 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 hello.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Subbo.
Hi everyone, Ashton Subbo here. And today we're going to be talking about Pramahansa Yogananda. Our guest is Peter Rader, who is the producer of the recent documentary about Yogananda called Awake, the Life of Yogananda. Peter, thanks for coming on the show today.
It's a pleasure.
So I actually have quite a long history with Yogananda. I grew up in Los Angeles. I used to go down, and I grew up surfing and would go down to the beach, and Lake Shrine is there, which is one of the SRF temples. And before I ever knew what or who Yogananda was, I used to go there. Growing up in LA, which is super crazy and hectic, I found this place, and it was just this little oasis amongst the chaos of Los Angeles. And I'd sit and I'd meditate, and every now and then I'd pop my head into the little chapel or even the bookstore, and I'd see some pictures of some Indian guys, and Jesus was there, and I was like, all right, cool, like this is nice, but never really knew who he was. And then actually my first yoga teacher training that I did was with Perry Ness, and she was coming from Vishnu Ghosh's lineage, which is, of course, Pramahansa Yogananda's younger brother. That exposed me to Autobiography of a Yogi. That was kind of what inspired a lot of my journeys and the start of my journey. I was on the path, I thought, to become a sannyas and become a monk. I gave up my possessions, went to Asia. The second teacher training that I did actually was with a man, David Goulet, who also was very much inspired back, I believe, either in the 60s or the 70s by Autobiography of a Yoga. So that was something that was very present in our trainings. He actually lived as a wandering monk in India for about a decade. And not only in the 2 trips that I went to India as well, I was initiated through Swami Shankarananda Giri at the Kriya Yoga Ashram in Rishikesh. And both times that I was in India as well, I made it a point to go to Badrinath, which of course is sort of a sacred site in the lineage where the mystical ashram of Babaji is. So I'm really thankful that you made this film, just because I think the message of Yogananda and his life is such a powerful one. What actually inspired you to make the film?
Well, we were approached to make the film by the organization. And in fact, there was one step before that, which is some donors, essentially, anonymous donors, approached the organization right around 6-7 years ago and said, we'll write the check to make this movie. It's time to make a movie about Yogananda. However, as a condition, we very much urge you to seek outside filmmakers. In other words, people who were not already steeped in the teachings. And, there's plenty of super talented film people within SRF, and they certainly could have mined from that pool of talent. But I think wisely they chose, let's get beginner's eyes, beginner's mind on this. Let's get a fresh outside perspective. And so the organization created a short list of candidates that they thought, would be good for to make a film about Yogananda. And my wife and I, Paolo Di Florio, who's one of the co-directors, were on the list, thankfully. So we kind of went in, and there's sort of a mutual audition process, because we had to be sure that we would be able to have journalistic integrity and kind of really make probe, turn over rocks, and kind of get in there. And the organization also needed to have their checks and balances. So we created a relationship that I think really worked ultimately, and it was fascinating, a really interesting process for kind of the ways in which we stretched the organization, and they also stretched us. I'll give you an example of that. All of us, so Paula co-directed the film with Lisa Lehman. They wrote and directed, and the three of us produced together. And all of us had spiritual practices before making the film. We were either meditators or had a yoga practice or both. Myself, I was in the Vipassana tradition. I was, insight meditating. And so certainly we had ways in to these teachings. However, there's a way in which Yogananda himself is so fervent in his embrace of God. God is all over his writings, that word, God, God, God. Now, for Westerners, that can be a very loaded word.
Absolutely.
What is God? I mean, the Western, traditional kind of conservative Western interpretation of God is like some dude, with a big beard and lightning bolts chucking down, fire from above. And sometimes it's a vindictive God, or it's a, sort of an Old Testament God. So, in fact, the story, the actual apocryphal story, this actually happened, was that Paula, in one of our very first meetings at SRF, turns right to the senior monks and says, "You guys need to know that I have a problem with the word God."
I like it, though. I like it.
Here's where it got interesting.
Yeah.
They didn't blink. They had no problem with that. Because Yogananda himself said, "Atheists are welcome to my talks. I don't have a problem. Yoga is scientific. It doesn't ask for a leap of faith. It doesn't ask for you to believe what I'm telling you. All I do is say to you, try these practices and see what happens. You're the scientist. It's in your control. Be the witness to the transformation of your consciousness." So the word God for Yogananda had a very broad definition, as it does to many people in India. So, for instance, he himself worshipped God in the form of Divine Mother. Now, there's a radical concept, especially for 1920s America, when he came over here. Divine Mother? Hello? What? Who? There's a feminine aspect to God? Yeah, there sure is. God is both male and female, and omniscient, omnipresent. I mean, God can be an energy field. God can be a feeling of love, a feeling of peace. For Yogananda, it's like, pick your point of entry. Whatever works for you can be your definition of God, and then cultivate this practice of devotion to it, to that force, that feeling, whatever it is, that quality. And, in that practice, your relationship will deepen and something will happen, and it's very private and it's very personal, and it's really about going on your unique individual journey. Now, there was something incredibly emancipating to us about that, about that really broad definition of God. And, when those senior monastics did not even blink, when the director of the film says, "I got a problem with the God word," they're like, "Great, figure your own way into it, and we're going to have a movie here."
I love that. It's kind of sidestepping from the actual topic of God itself, but you actually in the film, you guys have a few different people present sort of a definition of yoga, because we can kind of put Yogananda's teachings in an overall container of yoga. What is yoga for you personally? Like, how do you define the term yoga, or is that too broad of a question?
No, it's a great question. And the definition changed, of course, in the making of this film. I mean, for so many of the 18 million people who practice yoga in America, it's kind of a physical practice. It's an asana practice. It's hatha yoga, and that's great because there's huge benefits in it. But as we delved into our research and kind of made this film, we realized that yoga is really a way of life, and it's a very broad thing. In fact, in one of the yogis, we interviewed many of the prominent, Western yogis. Of course, most of them ended up on the cutting room floor, but we did interview them, and one of them basically had this incredibly broad definition of yoga, just saying any kinetic, anything in this world in which there's motion is yoga. So it's all yoga in a way. But for me personally, I'm realizing that yoga it's electing to aspire to a state of consciousness in everything that you do, and making kind of the recommitment on a sort of moment by moment basis to to an aspect of being serviceful in the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think that's also a big part of Yogananda's message as well, of seva and service and giving back to the world. And that's something I really appreciate about him. In all the different interviews that you're doing, both with Western yogis and people through SRF and everything else, what was the wildest story that someone shared with you about their experience with Yogananda? Whether it was, I don't know if there are now still people that were alive when he was, but I still, with Yogananda devotees, they have some pretty fascinating stories about interactions even now. Do you have a kind of an out there story that someone shared with you?
Yeah, you know what? This story kept repeating itself. This one was what happened in multiple interviews, which is the way people encountered Yogananda's teachings, or sort of stepped onto this path, was almost absurdly comical. It was like the book fell off a shelf and hit them in the head. We heard that from at least 3 people, where it was like they're walking through a bookstore, and suddenly this book comes falling down, and boom, and now it's in their hand. It's like, wake up, hello, read this book, and George Harrison has a great quote in the film where he just said he keeps stacks of those books and he hands it out to anyone who needs, quote, regrooving. Yeah. He would say, read this book. But so that was a recurring motif, is just how, that whole thing about the guru finding you when you're receptive. It's like, this guru moves books and has them fall on your head.
So, something that I learned from the film that I didn't know beforehand was that apparently Yogananda had a very profound effect on Steve Jobs. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Right. So Steve Jobs is of that generation, kind of, hippie, late 60s, early 70s generation, so many of whom were really seeking, and the place to seek was, of course, India, and a lot of them headed over there. Krishna Das, a lot of those guys, Jack Kornfield, so many of those Buddhist teachers also just headed over to the Far East in the late 60s and early 70s, and Jobs was one of them. He read that book, and he did a couple of acid trips, and I don't know whether he read it before or after, but somewhere in there he just said, you know what, I got to go to India. And his entire career was deeply influenced by this book and its messages. The book is so, for those of you who have not read it, it's incredibly dense. It warrants about 10 reads. Maybe in 10 reads you're going to get to the essence of it, but certainly every time you reread it, something new emerges from those pages. And MC Yogi, who was someone we interviewed for the film, says that he read it in a halfway house in Brooklyn, where he had gotten into a lot of trouble as a young kid. He's in this halfway house, he reads the book, and he says, magic was exuding from the pages. I was changing as I was reading the book. And for someone, back to Jobs for a moment, it influenced so many aspects of how he used his creativity. This idea of seeking inward, seeking the going inward and seeking the inner guidance and looking for inspiration from within. That's something that he practiced throughout. And, he had apparently, in his last months of life, only one book on his iPad, and it was Autobiography of a Yogi. And also, he choreographed his own memorial service, the giveaway to the 800 dignitaries who were there, including Bill Gates and Bill Clinton, was the Autobiography of a Yogi. He gave out 800 of those books to these VIPs.
So after having made this film about Yogananda and with all of your experiences communicating with people and interviewing people and going over all the footage, what ultimately to you do you feel is Yogananda's most important message or teaching? Like what is he trying to convey through the world or to the world through his teachings?
If you had to reduce it down to one word, it would probably be love. He said when he knew that he was about to leave this planet, he said, after me, all that will remain is love. And I mean, it's actually a pretty good word. It's also kind of a loaded word in a sense.
Yeah.
But if you interact with the world and other people with that basic principle, it's going to serve you. I mean, that's a good default. If you just go with the love thing, that's going to be really good.
Awesome. Well, you had mentioned that a lot of things ended up on the cutting room floor. What was the most fascinating thing that you ended up having to cut from the film that didn't make it on the reel, but like was still pretty mind blowing?
You know, there were so many. We had 300 hours of footage. There's a mini series in this movie. We distilled it down to sort of a palatable 87 minutes for the novice, for the person who's never been exposed to these teachings. And also, there's plenty in there. There's all sorts of layers in the film. You know, certain people have seen the film 27, 30 times. That I think is the record. There's a woman who's seen it 30 times. Because certainly for devotees, there's a tremendous amount of energy in the film. Anytime Yogananda's on screen, he's kind of rocketing off the screen. But also in the filmmaking process, we literally created layers. Sometimes, you know, for people who know video editing, we had 6 or 7 layers of video, just subtle kind of maya, you know, veils and smoke and other things and below it all was this one little thing, and it was a metaphor or a symbol. And if you know what that metaphor is, it's going to possibly take you to, you know, a state that we were trying to evoke. But in terms of what didn't make it, one of my favorite things was we had the honor of actually filming in a cloistered monastery, actually more than once, but here in Los Angeles, Mount Washington, his main ashram, for the first time ever, they let these not only just outsiders, but like Hollywood filmmakers, you know, with our cameras into monastic life. And so I was not allowed to go into the nuns' quarters. So Paula and Lisa filmed that side, and I filmed, you know, with the monks, like for instance, going into their meditation. And it was so beautiful and profound and just radiant with mystical kind of spiritual energy. It's just this gorgeous sequence that we cut and didn't make it into the film, which is monastic life, the life of renunciation for people who are absolutely convinced that their purpose in this incarnation is to find divinity. Then yes, this is the path. You know, that was really cool.
There's a moment in the film that I really like as well, where I think it's Herb Jeffries, and he's talking about his experience with Yogananda, and it's something that I think is a powerful message, especially kind of in today's day and age, where he's talking about like, you know, hey, you know, I'm drinking, I'm smoking, I'm womanizing, you know, and he's talking to Yogananda, and he's like, hey, can I, you know, he's heard all these things he can't do in his life, and you know, he goes to Yogananda and he says, you know, I'm still doing these things. And Yogananda's like, it's fine. You know, you can keep doing them. He's like, wait a second, I can keep doing all these things? And he's like, yes, you know, you can do them, but I can't promise you that the desire to do them is going to stay there if you keep doing these practices. And for me, as a yoga teacher, that's so profound, because you have a lot of people that are trying to force from the other direction of like, you need to do this, and that. Stop doing this. Don't eat animals. Do this, do that. And it kind of shows a lack of trust in the teachings themselves, because if the teachings really have value, they're going to bring that about naturally. It brings its own transformation. You don't need to like force anyone into anything. And you know, that was something that's very powerful for me, because I appreciate it so much. I'm curious, kind of within that context of how these teachings work on us, with your own story creating this film, how did this film work on you or change you through the process of making it?
Well, you know, it's a profound question, and each of us, the three, you know, main filmmakers, have our unique stories of that, and it's, you know, and it's kind of private, and it's evolving. It's evolving. You know, for me, it's really something that's evolving. I think the biggest shift for me was this aspect of bhakti, you know, devotion, and how you can have this really intimate, very personal relationship with something that's real. I mean, it is real. It interacts with you. It's amazing, you know, in a deep meditation, that you could actually have this experience, you know, and that was mind blowing for me, because, you know, coming from the sort of Buddhist tradition of no mind, of emptiness. So you're going to the void. You're going to, no mind, and there you rest. Versus, okay, you get there, and there's actually something there. There's something there that can actually you can interact with. That was, profound and crazy, and I'm still trying to work with it.
I think that's something that's wonderful, not only in a lot of the Indian traditions, but in particular in Bhakti traditions as well. And it came through in the film of, having a personal relationship with the divine, and a big part of Yogananda's message, and a big contrast to our typical Western relationships with the divine, which is always through a priest, through a church. And so much of what yoga as a whole is trying to cultivate is a deeper and very personal relationship to the divine, which I think is extremely empowering for everyone, because it allows that, like, okay, I don't need to do this through anyone. I can do this paradoxically, not with myself per se, because the self is kind of what's kind of getting in the way of it all, but that I can have this experience of otherness. I think you mentioned love being such a loaded word, but I think what can kind of, and heart kind of carries along with love and is very connected to. And I think we have in our culture the language there already. When somebody has a really big heart, it's this idea of, they're getting beat up in a sporting event, but they're always doing something more, or they're always helping someone else. And it's our capacity in love to put something else ahead of the ego and the mind. And so many of these practices are taking that place to help kind of dive underneath the mind and all its various thought forms and identities and things it's attaching to have this greater experience of something. And as you said too, there's all these different ways to step into it, wherever you're getting into, like, okay, you want God with form, you want God without form, you want a feminine form, a masculine form. That's another thing that in India they did so well, because there's literally millions of gods for them to worship, because there's millions of people, and like, hey, I want to interact with the God that speaks to me this way, and I think is so wonderfully beautiful about the traditions. So what, in terms of the film, I know now it's on Netflix, and there's the DVD. What are the ways that people can see the film? Those are two examples. Are there other ways? Are there good ways? Are you guys ever going to release any of that extra footage? Is that part of a conversation? Like, what's going on with all that?
It is. In terms of the bonus footage, we're thinking about kind of, next year or maybe a couple years out, doing sort of a re-release of the DVD with some bonus stuff. But for now, the film is available, as you said, on Netflix. It's on iTunes. It's on our website. You can rent it digitally right off our website, awaketheyoganandamovie.com. We also have a soundtrack, which is really nice. It's a sort of a meditative soundtrack. The two composers did an amazing job, Michael Malora and Vivek Madala. And we also have this gorgeous book that SRF Publications put out that we're calling the Companion Book, which has 400 photographs and photo layouts that are amazingly photoshopped, that really give you a sense in book form of that movie. There's also a complete transcript in there, as well as forwards and afterwards by some of the filmmakers and also some monks. It's a really nice book. Anyway, all of that is available on our website. But one of the things that we're saying, in fact, we just sent out a newsletter to this effect, is that fantastic for you to watch this film, on Netflix, in your home or whatever, or iTunes. But there is still something to be said about gathering as a community and seeing it. So we continue to have screenings, theatrical on-demand screenings and community screenings. It's available for yoga centers and everything. There's something about that shared experience. We saw it. We screened the movie probably 275 times or so over the course of the last year. And over and over again, there's this energy in the room that's just undeniable. It's really cool.
Well, I think, and you pointed to this earlier too, but the film itself has its own vibratory quality to it. The photos of Yogananda always exude this like force in them. I think they talk about it, some people talk about in the film too, with his eyes of just like they're lasers zapping at you, and whether it was in person or through a film or through photos. I have this photo on my altar of Yogananda meditating, and still even just that, like, he's sitting in lotus. I think he just has like a loincloth on or something like that, and it's just very like super powerful of presence. And I think that's exciting that there's a book of these photos out there as well. For you personally, what's next for you in terms of your projects? Your production studio is Counterpoint Films, correct? What's going on for you guys next?
Yeah, so we're in the process of trying to figure out what that next film is. There's about 2 or 3 candidates that we're developing, and the sort of driving kind of log line of Counterpoint Films is entertainment that empowers the human spirit. And Paolo was just at the Parliament of World Religions in Salt Lake City, which for the first time ever had the inaugural Women's Assembly, female spiritual leaders and female spiritual leadership, and talking about integrating the feminine aspect in our dialogue and balancing it. It's not about taking over. This, to us, is like totally the main theme of what we need to be focusing on right now, is this idea of balanced leadership and bringing in the feminine principle into kind of the way we approach, the kind of daunting tasks that's before us. So we have a number of projects that are going to kind of hopefully address that theme.
I love that. Well, not only because especially in our Western culture, it's important to bring in some more balance of the feminine. I also have a young daughter, so reading up about you guys before our talk today, and your wife's work with sort of these strong female characters and things like that, I think that's really exciting as well, so that women do have, and young girls do have, a strong sense of like direction and purpose and examples of that. But as well, for whether you're a young boy or a young girl, understanding that there are feminine qualities in the world that are extremely powerful, extremely important, instead of just all this one-sided, very, very masculine, very rational-minded type of thinking, which sort of predominates the modern world in most parts, and is, in some ways, is responsible for some of our greatest accomplishments, but it's also responsible for some of our greatest downfalls that are currently destroying the world. So bringing back the feminine to help nourish the world again, I think, is a really important task for people to be taking on. So that's exciting that you guys are doing that. Thank you. Mm-hmm. That's it for today. We will have all of the websites and all of that available in show notes for everybody, so people can check out your website, check out the site for all of the things for Awake, and you said they can purchase the book on there and the audio CD and all that, so they can definitely look for that, and we'll continue to look for your next projects that are coming out. I really appreciate you talking with us today, Peter. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure and an honor.
Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this episode, let us know by writing a review on iTunes. It's the only way that we know if we should keep producing more episodes like these. It also helps us attract new listeners to join us every week and spread the word of yoga, spirituality, and conscious living. Thanks so much for listening. Hope you'll join us again next week.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.